So once again, hi, I am Elizabeth Lee, and you are at the Winter 2021 Lyceum series for the Whallonsburg Grange. The Grange, for those of you who don't know, is an amazing community in an amazing place. And we are a community of volunteers, and we are very fortunate that tonight we have two of our board members as presenters. We are looking forward to their program on the interesting entanglement of storytelling, history, and historical fiction. I would like to just, as I do as often as I can, thank the amazing volunteers, both who are just workers on projects as well as the board members who have been many over the years, and the community members who support the Grange's activities. We have a great film series and the Lyceum series. This is the 10th, the Lyceum series has been going for 10 years. And we are very, very grateful to the Glenn and Carol Pearsall Foundation for their support this past year, helping for us to put this Lyceum series online. We are, as we come to the end of this series, we are always looking for ideas, and we welcome your input into the series. So with further ado, I want to thank Andy Buchanan and Andrea Barrett, both of whom are board members and members of the Lyceum Committee at the Grange, and both with a unique angle on storytelling. And I'll let them introduce themselves. We are very, very lucky to have both of them in our midst and to be guiding our interpretation of our own stories as well as the larger stories around us. So Andy and Andrea, go right ahead.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And welcome everybody. Thanks for taking the evening off to listen to us and to join the Lyceum. Andy and I have been talking for months now, like everyone else, about the pandemic and its effects on our community and the culture at large. Pandemics aren't just about numbers, as everybody knows. They're about people and politics and transformed human relations. And they also come to be about how we remember them and tell stories about them as we prepare for what's to come. What details do we choose to remember and transmit? Who does that choosing? What counts as evidence? And how do our two deeply entangled disciplines, Andy's a historian while I write historical fiction, differ in their approaches to the same material? From the outside, history can look like a simple recounting of facts and events, while historical fiction can look like history light, simplified and overlaid with the sugary varnish of character and plot. One thing we've discovered in our conversations, though, is how wrong those preconceptions can be, and how similar some of our working processes really are. We're going to start by looking at a bit of narrative history that Andy wrote, draft paragraphs from the first chapter of his book in progress. These are on the handout we posted earlier if you want to follow along while he reads. We're also going to show you a photograph he used as inspiration and source material, and possibly a 1945 article that he used at the ending, though I'm not sure we're going to get to that. Andy, I want to ask you to read those paragraphs, but maybe just start by telling us what the book's about a little bit.
Okay, so we're going to try and share the screen here, and this is live radio, folks. So let's see what happens. Okay, I think you got that. So this is the image that I'm going to be talking a little bit about.
Andy, if you want to go ahead and click on that as if you were starting your slideshow, it will show as the first slide and it'll eliminate some of the other.
Okay, yeah, good point. Hang on one second. Oh, there you go.
There you are. That's better.
Okay, so for those of you who read the handout by Andrea and the little essay on dust, this is the nucleation site, right?
Yeah.
This is the nucleation site of the beginning of this new book, and the book doesn't even really have a title yet. It's going to be the working title, which is From Long War to Post-War: Revolution, Decolonization, and the Rise of the United States. And it's basically about the transition from from World War II into the post-war period and the establishment of American global hegemony. And the image here is I'm just going to talk a little bit about it, and then I think Andrea's got some things to say about it, and we're going to get into the discussion. So this is just the very first paragraph of the, well, as of now, this is the first paragraph of the book. Okay, here we go. So, sitting atop the gun turrets of the battleship USS Missouri that Sunday morning, with their legs swinging free over the armored sides, American sailors enjoyed a grandstand view. Framed by the Missouri's own massive guns, American warships, from hulking battleships to sleek destroyers, filled Tokyo Bay and stretched into the offing. Above, silver B-29 super fortresses roared by, over 400 of them. Over the previous months, these bombers had razed every major Japanese city in a relentless campaign, culminating in the nuclear annihilation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The bombers were followed by wave after wave of carrier-based fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers. These were the Avengers, Corsairs, Hellcats, and Helldivers that had destroyed the once proud Japanese Navy in a series of sprawling battles from the Coral Sea and Midway to the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf. Riding low in the water, 12 submarines represented the underwater flotillas that had prowled the waters around Japan, sinking merchant ships and their vital cargoes of fuel and raw materials. Their efforts had combined with those of the bombers to destroy Japan's industrial capacity and with it the ability to wage modern war. The warships were joined at anchor by support vessels of all kinds. These were the supply ships, fast oil tankers, troop transports and landing craft, and hospital ships that constituted the fleet train that had kept the warships at sea, given them their extraordinary strategic range, repaired their battle damage, and cared for their wounded. So that's the very first paragraph of the book. You want to say something about it now? Do you want to say? Yeah.
I do want to point out some of the language choices there, but before that, I want to ask you, how did you choose that image? I mean, it's a big book and it's a big topic. How did you choose to start there? And what does it mean that you started with that image?
The starting point of the book is thinking about the scope of America's military victory at the end of World War II. And there's actually, this is probably one of the most photographed events in, I mean, there's literally hundreds of photographs of it from all kinds of different angles. And again, that idea of an image or an event that kind of focuses a whole series of things that I wanted to talk about. Obviously, one of them is the sheer scale and power of the American military victory, which I think you see very graphically in this image. But also the sort of, I don't know, I love these guys sitting on the turret, dangling their feet over. You know, there's a sort of there's a degree of not exactly carefreeness, but of a sort of assumption of that of predominance, of domination, of victory, that's sort of really graphically illustrated in the image, I think. So it was really the image that led me to write the paragraph, not the other way around. And so from the image, I then actually did quite a lot of research on how many ships were there and what kinds of ships they were and what kinds of airplanes were flying over, and kind of built up the whole thing from that.
That's really amazing, and it's also one of the reasons we chose to start here tonight is because so much is conveyed in this paragraph, and so much is conveyed in the photograph, and then so much is conveyed in Andy's way of writing about the photograph. For those of you who have the handout around, I just want to steer you towards a couple of the words that stick out to me here. Things I noticed are he says their legs are swinging free, which you can see in the photograph, but swinging free, the choice of the word swinging with all that it implies, and that they're swinging free with all that implies. That he talks about hulking battleships and sleek destroyers, again, kind of insidiously steering us to think images of power and dominance and war. He talks about the bombers razed every major Japanese city. It's a relentless campaign. It culminates in annihilation. The flotillas prowl the water. Later on, a paragraph he didn't read, his next one, he talks about MacArthur's casual insouciance. And the reason I point out these words, to get back to our original idea of history not being neutral and not really being any more neutral than historical fiction is, when you use adjectives and nouns like that, and you use those in the opening paragraph in a book, and this is a compliment and not an insult, you are doing anything but being objective or just presenting a neutral set of facts. Andy's a scrupulous researcher, so this is scrupulously accurate, but the language he's choosing, his adjectives, his nouns, his verbs, are steering us from the very opening lines of this book to feel a certain way about American power at the end of the war, to feel a certain way about what's going to happen in the next 10 years. And those are all the same tools that a fiction writer uses. And that's why we say our disciplines are so very deeply entangled. If I was writing a piece of historical fiction about this time and place, I probably would have made a lot of the same choices that Andy made. I would have looked for a photograph, a really powerful image with which to start. I would have tried to use, though probably wouldn't have done as good a job, these same resources of charged language and rhetoric and rhythm to surreptitiously steer my reader into a certain headspace and a certain kind of mood before I even began to unfold the events. And that's what Andy did with us there. And that's also what people who write fiction do, whether it's historical fiction or fiction set in our time and place. We're both of us, historians and writers of historical fiction, we are manipulating our readers. We know we are, we do it consciously. In the case of historians—
I think we're actually failed poets.
Yeah, it's the same thing.
I mean, one of the things that I really enjoyed about writing this paragraph was the lists.
Yeah.
And that's a very sort of poetic device, I think. So it's not a book of poetry, but the names of the airplanes, the names of the battles, the names of the types of ships,
Absolutely.
the lists of things. It's I don't know if it's quite as self-consciously done as you're suggesting, but it is about taking a scene and using it to create in the reader's mind a sense and an image of what the book's going to be about and what they can expect to follow.
I'm guessing, although I'm not sure, that some historians are more conscious than others about their manipulations and about the way they're employing rhetoric to steer people in the early stages of a book. Everyone's doing it, but are you aware that you're doing it? You're very aware.
I mean, I'm very aware that I'm doing it. I mean, partly I'm aware that I'm doing it because I'm also aware that I'm pushing back against a predominant narrative, right. and so that's always in my mind in thinking about how to craft particularly the opening sentences, particularly the opening paragraphs of a chapter of a piece, where you're really trying to create the whole mood of what's going to be coming in. You know, I think one of the things that was really interesting, and we've been on a lot of walks together discussing this over the last several weeks, months actually, is how similar those processes are, and in a certain sense, I guess how thin the pretense of objectivity on the part of historical writing is. Having said that, I have to say that one of the reasons that this is only a provisional paragraph is I was dismayed to find that even in this, some of the facts I have in this are not actually facts. That in fact some of the ships I claim to have been there weren't actually there. The big aircraft carriers didn't come into Tokyo Harbor, for example. The planes didn't follow each other; they crossed over each other's paths. So even at the factual level, there's some things I now have to go back and, because I am scrupulous about it, that I have to go back and fix, which really wouldn't be a problem for you as a novelist. It's not.
I mean, that's one of the things that differs between us. If I had written a paragraph that worked that successfully, and then I found out that the planes, rather than flying in parallel, were flying orthogonally to each other, I wouldn't change it because it worked emotionally. And Andy would change it because he's a historian.
I feel compelled to change
You
it.
have to change it. That's your job.
So.
But with those very minor exceptions, our tasks are basically the same until you get down to one big separating thing. And that's that historical novelists, we have one more tool that historians don't have, and that's that we can use character to illuminate emotion. Most historians will not enter into the minds of a character, and if they do enter in, they'll use a lot of qualifying phrases like she might have thought or she could have been considering, whereas we'll just plunge in, and we'll plunge in because our ultimate goal is different. I'm not trying to tell history in a sweeter way, in a lighter way. I'm not trying to feed the reader facts. I'm trying to make you feel what it was like to be doing that. Oh, sorry.
We're getting some production advice.
Yes.
We're going to stop screen. We're going to stop sharing the screen. You've
Okay.
seen the image. There you go.
There we go.
Thanks.
All
I
right.
think I was going to suggest it too. So I think that's
I think
great.
you can
Good to
just
see.
Yeah.
And we can share that image again at the end of the.
Okay. Anyway, so about character, my task isn't really to make sugar-coated history. My task is not to make a reductive historical statement. I'm trying to do something else. I'm trying to make you feel like what it was like to be alive there, and to be moving through a certain set of events under certain constraints. If I can't connect to a character and I can't create a character that can compellingly do that, then there's really no reason for me to be writing. Good narrative history is always more interesting than bad historical fiction. There's a lot of bad historical fiction in the world, but I feel strongly about fiction that doesn't do any more than tell history more feebly and with less resources and with fewer footnotes. I don't think that's our job. I wrote about this.
Yeah, I was going to say. So you
Yeah.
approached some of these questions in the article that we sent out for you all to take a look at. I've already stolen one of the ideas of the nucleation sites,
Yeah,
which I really love, and sort of giving you an example of that. So I mean, maybe you'd like to say a little bit more about that.
You can read the essay, but it's basically about why I didn't write a particular novel about a particular very well documented 19th century British physicist. And I thought at first that it was because there was so much known about him that there was no room left for me to invent. And then I realized what a feeble assumption that is. One of the ways I realized it was by reading Hilary Mantel's Great Wolf Hall history. Thomas Cromwell is very well documented. Tudor history is very well known. She still found a way to illuminate that and to make us understand things. And she did that. That's about angle of vision. It's about occupying a particular stance and a particular narrative tone, and making you feel what it was like to be him. Andy's read that. I don't know if you learned much history through that, but I bet you learned.
I mean, I had Tudor and Stuart history pounded into my skull from a very early age, and then studied at college. So I mean, I didn't actually learn very much about how about the Reformation, English Reformation, or how Tudor government worked. But I feel I learned an awful lot about how power works in general. And what it's like to look through the eyes of someone who's constantly evaluating people around him for their strength as allies or their potential weaknesses, and how people can be used in different ways, and what it's like to work for a powerful but capricious boss like Henry VIII, and I don't think you could. I mean, I think you get I think I had a deeper appreciation of what actually felt like
Yeah.
from the novels than simply by reading history, a straight history. So there's definitely some, I mean, I think somewhere here you say sort of bringing something additional to the table. I think that's true for good historical fiction, that you're bringing something that's I really wanted to get into the heads of one of those guys on the gun turrets and talk about what he was feeling and seeing and what it that internal sense of what being there felt like, and I couldn't do that.
I mean, you can do a million other things, which we just heard in that paragraph, but that's illegal for you.
It's totally illegal, and every so often bad historians cross that line, and you recognize it immediately. And as you say, it's often done with qualifications. And I was very tempted to do this myself. They must have felt, they should have felt, they surely did feel X, Y, or Z, and that's, I don't think historians can do that. I mean, another example, I'm not going to quote from it. I tried to find, this is Vasily Grossman's Life and Fate, which is a novel about Soviet Russia, Stalingrad, and so on during World War II. And I was going to try and find the quote, but it's 1,000 pages, and I couldn't actually locate it. But there's a point in there where he describes, I've read a lot of history of the Soviet Union and thinking about how Stalinism worked and bureaucracy works and so on and so forth. But there's a point in the book there where he describes that it's not just constant pressure, constant repression, constant fear, but what really broke people was that then there were moments of hope, and that you could see a way forward, and suddenly the top guys were smiling on you, and you could see a little way of advance. And it was the alternation of repression and hope that was so devastating. And I'd never understood that about how bureaucratic states operate. You think of it as just everybody's, show trials and gulags and all the rest, which is an important part of it, but it's not the whole story. And fiction illuminated that to me in a way that I don't think the straight history would have done.
I mean, that's the thing that you can really only do with character. Tone in a piece of narrative history comes from the narrative voice that the historian establishes, and you heard that very clearly in what Andy read. That's both Andy's voice and it's not Andy's voice. Andy's created a narrator for that book that has a particular intellect, a particular sound, a particular way of using lists, and a particular way of presenting information to us. And how engaged we are in that book and how we follow that depends on the success of that narrative voice. In historical fiction, that angle of vision can be a character's voice or a character's thoughts, and it's the way the writer manipulates those thoughts and those voices that allows us a different insight into what we're doing. So when that goes wrong, it's horrible. When it goes right, it's really useful because you have those moments of clarity. There's a historical novel I'm very fond of. It's very brief. It's called The Blue Flower. It's by a British writer named Penelope Fitzgerald. She published this when she was 80. It is about the extremely improbable subject of the German romantic writer Novellas. It's a tiny book. It's done in 44 tiny chapters, and it's very brilliant. You read the book and somehow you emerge from it knowing everything important about Novellas, German Romanticism, Goethe, everything else you can imagine. There's no details, there's no faffing around about what was going on philosophically. She makes you feel the whole thing. But in an introduction to a new edition of that, the British novelist Andrea McWilliams wrote this about Fitzgerald. Her approach to her material is interior, never merely stretching of an aestheticized membrane over prefigured events. And Andy and I both keep coming back to that phrase, the aestheticized membrane over prefigured events. It's a great phrase, and it's also a really savage indictment of bad historical fiction. First of all, the idea that there are prefigured events, that history is not written, that historians don't have a point of view, that selection of detail, where to start, where to end, what to show in scene, what to compress in summary, doesn't matter. There's that whole set of issues. And also the idea that there's a point in making an aestheticized membrane, that what we're trying to do as fiction writers is to drape this diaphanous veil of sort of treacly sentiment. Thank you, I'll type that one for my own. You know, over the prefigured event. That really captures everything that can go wrong in historical fiction. And that's also why I didn't write that book that I wrote about in Dust. I knew it was going to be a bad novel, and I'd rather read good history than a bad historical novel. There's just no point in having those.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm just going to pick up on one of the questions here, because it kind of speaks directly to this. This is Stephen Englehart's question here, which is if someone on the gun deck had written about what it was like to be there, you could have used that, right? And the answer is yes, and they did. There are letters from sailors who were there who wrote home and described described the scene, and I did think about using them.
Yeah.
But none of them. It gets back to that sort of pre-existing fact sort of question that none of them were really quite what. They didn't quite say what I wanted to say, and I didn't want to start chopping their words up and distort. So I decided not to go that route. But
wait, I gotta pause you there for a minute, because I mean that's the whole thing in a nutshell. You had the material, you had the evidence. It didn't do what you wanted it to do, so you didn't use it.
So I didn't. I mean, it didn't contradict. I mean, if it had been like this was pathetic and we wished, you know, if it had contradicted that, would have been. It just didn't. It didn't do the narrative work that I wanted it to do.
And so right there, without your readers even knowing or knowing through that process, you made this huge decision to withhold, in a sense, information from them to steer them in the direction that you wanted to go.
Correct. Now you're making me sound really bad.
No, but this is what makes good history. Is I mean that ability to select the right detail and discard the wrong detail is also what makes good historical fiction.
Absolutely.
You know, knowing what to throw out, knowing what not to use, knowing what's the crucial element and what's just bullshit, like the color of the street lamps. That's a writing thing.
Yeah.
I think that there are a lot of questions, Andy. And
you want us to? Yeah, we can.
That's fine.
Let's break form and try a few of these questions, because some of them might, I think, be interesting for you to answer. So Catherine asked the question, Andy, did you mention the top hats in your text? They stand out for me in the photo. One that a detail you intentionally
actually I do,
or didn't stand out to you.
I think I do actually go on in the second. Thank you, Catherine. I did go on. I actually went on in the second paragraph to say something about to actually, there is a point to the top hats, which is the point. The point is the Japanese delegation this is the surrender. This is Japanese surrender. So the Japanese delegation arrives. The military officers are in full uniform. The diplomats are in top hats and tails, and they're you could see from that image. But the Americans, even MacArthur, who's the main American general who's organizing, receiving the surrender, his shirt's open, his tie-less. He's got a crumpled old uniform on. I mean, there's a tremendous contrast, which is sort of part of that. It's the insouciance that I was talking about is part of the sort of the humiliation of the Japanese delegation by this tremendous demonstration of not just power, but the sort of almost careless exercise of power. So I do go on to talk about it. I think you're absolutely right, Catherine. It's a very striking part of the image.
So that answer also kind of covers Marion's question about who is in the first photo. So is there anybody else that you wanted to point out who's in that photo? Or?
You can't. I mean, you're looking down on the heads of the Allied delegation. There's a guy in a French officer's cap, and there's other people in there. I mean, it's the Allied delegation. Sort of you're looking down on them, and then basically the ship's crew of the Missouri who are basically observing, but by their observation, they're sort of also playing a role in the ceremony. I mean,
Yeah.
they're not, they become part of it and part of what's been sort of said there in that broader, you know, in that broader sense.
Yeah, so much is being said to non-verbally
Yeah.
to the Japanese
Yeah.
delegation by every aspect of
Yeah.
people's dress and posture and casualness. It's very powerful.
It's tremendous. I mean, and they spent a lot of time literally choreographing how that whole thing was, in order to send those precisely those messages. So I was very interested in sort of getting inside of that. And for those of you who read the book, when it's done, you'll see that's the sort of starting, that's the jumping off point for the whole discussion on the character of American political and military power at the end of World War II.
And that's why it's a great opening.
Great. So let's go on. Marinelle has a question. How do both of you introduce characters into the narrative? Is there a difference between nonfiction and fiction when you put dialogue into your writing?
Yeah. Andy can correct me if I'm wrong, but I can do whatever I want. I can introduce them first in a line of dialogue, or first with an image, or first by someone else responding to them. I can do that when I want. I can do that where I want. I do not believe that Andy can introduce a line of dialogue unless he has evidence for it.
And again, this goes back to Stephen's comment about, are we, you know, I mean, you could say, I could have begun it by saying, you know, petty officer so-and-so noted that, you know, this was a tremendous show of our power. It really taught the Japanese who's who. You know, I mean, there are comments like that. And then also, you know, being a historian, then of course it would be footnoted and would be a reference at the bottom. But you can't really do that. They're very useful sometimes. But that would be it. I'm not then going to go on to say, you know, he'd eaten a wonderful breakfast that morning, and you know, the guy next to him was really sweaty, and you know, I mean, you know, all the other kinds, and he's actually really thinking about his girlfriend rather than the ceremony guy. You know, I can't do that. Whereas you can.
I can, but I would have to know what I meant by doing that. So again, that's where we're entangled. Andy chose to leave out certain things because they weren't making his point, weren't starting his book correctly. I might choose to include certain things to make a very different point. Were I to invent a character who, watching this ceremony, was really thinking about his girlfriend and cutting his toenails and not really looking at MacArthur, I would be saying something about the attitude of that person towards war and towards the weariness at the end of war, and maybe in a larger sense about his attitude towards politics in general, towards America in general. I would only do it if I wanted to make those points. We're always making points, both of us. That's the point of this, I guess.
Great. And another related question, Michelle asks, Andrea, would a historical fiction author create a new scene for the character to deal with what was not true to life?
That depends on the writer, and writers of historical fiction range very widely in their attitude towards this. We all have our own rules we play by, and we set the net in different places. Where I set my net is if I have evidence for something, I will not contradict it. If a certain person, if Henry James is known to have been in Paris on a certain day eating dinner with a certain person, I won't move him to England on that night and have him eating dinner with someone else because my plot would like to. I just don't, because that's where I'm comfortable with. I like to work within those constraints and then sort of tunnel down and around and imagine other things. But by the same token, really good writers of historical fiction will alter chronology, will change events, will even change outcomes for their own purposes. And again, they'll change them to make a point. Their point is maybe not to recount that event scrupulously accurately, but to illuminate some other aspect of the culture of the time. And I can't fault them for doing that. They're playing a different game than I'm playing. You know, one of us is playing ping pong, one of us is playing badminton. They're not either of them bad games. They're different games.
So interesting. Okay, Catherine notes, I read Pale Horse, Pale Rider in prep for this, a perfect example where fiction was much more able to explain the nature of a pandemic. The historical numbers are not the point. The description of the lived experience was much more powerful.
Oh, that's
That's
great.
great.
Then she follows that up with not really a question, except maybe for Andrea to talk about how that kind of thing works.
If I really knew how that kind of thing worked, I would be a very lucky woman.
And I should say, we were going to spend a lot of time tonight talking about Pale Horse, Pale Rider. And in fact, Andrea brought enough copies of it to populate all the local libraries with it. So if you need one, then we have some, I think we have some spares.
I do.
Yeah, we have some, but we actually decided to go in a different direction because, and it was an interesting discussion because actually Pale Horse, Pale Rider, which is a story of the flu pandemic after World War I, is, I'm gonna say it's sort of more like autobiographical than it is fictional, and it didn't really quite fit in what we wanted to talk about tonight. Having said that, then to Catherine's point, yeah, the question of what being inside of a pandemic feels like.
I think she captured that. I mean, there's really two great pieces of fiction about the flu pandemic of 1918, and this is one. The other is a novel by William Maxwell called So Long, See You Tomorrow. Both Maxwell and Porter lived through the pandemic. Maxwell was a little boy, his mother died, and Porter was a young woman, and the events that she covers in Pale Horse, Pale Rider track pretty closely to the events of her own life, which is why Andy says it's really drawing on autobiographical elements. But at the same time, it's not a novel, it's a novella. It's really short, and it conveys more powerfully than anything else I know what it's like to live through a pandemic, the scope of the whole thing. How she does that there's a lot of different elements. One is the sheer poetic power of her language and her willingness to not linger long in scene, but to go off into dreams and into reveries that compress and condense the whole experience of the pandemic. The other is she has tricks of rhetoric that are actually pretty similar to Andy's. There's a famous image in that novel, you might, in the novella, you might remember of Miranda looking at a man who's sitting he's sitting on the edge of a desk, and she uses a figure to describe his legs in their empty little gray pants. He's trying to force her to buy a war bond. And just the way she describes him by his legs and the spindliness of his legs within his pants encapsulates a whole class of people who are self-righteous about the war and insecure because they haven't gone to the war and unsure about their status with women and unsure about their status in all sorts of ways. She does it in like a line. It would take me 10 pages to do that, but that's what makes her a great writer. It's a really good book. I do have copies, willing to share.
Great. Yes, that looks like a great.
And we sort of went on from that to look at Daniel Dufoe as well, whose famous Journal of a Plague Year masquerades as a
memoir.
A memoir.
Yeah.
But he was actually way too young to have remembered anything of the plague in London in 1666 or 7. But that book captures some wonderful sense of what it's like to live within a pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, it's a novel. He wrote it 50 years after the pandemic, but it's a first-person book that purports to be the true history of someone who lived through it, in the same way that Robinson Crusoe purports to be a true history. And again, he brings it alive by these amazing details of
vinegar.
Yeah, the vinegar. We have hand sanitizer. In London in 1665, they had bowls of vinegar. So he talks about having to go out for food every day because he was too silly to lay in food before the pandemic really struck hard, and dropping coins into a bowl full of vinegar, and then the tradesperson picking the coins up after they'd been cleansed in the vinegar, people sopping their heads in vinegar, dousing their hair when they come back from shopping in the same way. It's so much
exchanging goods at the end of long sticks.
Yeah.
Which you know, I'm going to say this now, you know, which really speaks to the, I mean, to me, really spoke to the sense of that we've all experienced of people avoiding, I mean, physically avoiding other people. Yeah. Whether you might be out on a trail or something and in the middle of nowhere and people come towards you and you realize they're frightened of you, or you're frightened of each other in a sense that just wasn't true a year ago. And you could read a lot of histories of pandemic that tell you a lot of the facts. And I did the first lecture in the previous series that looked, but didn't, you know, it was great. It's a fine lecture, but it didn't get inside what that felt like. Yeah. And I don't think that history can do that, but I think historical fiction can bring that. It does give something that's not strictly going to be there in the same way, I think.
Yeah, again, like the photograph we started with, Dufoe succeeds in that by finding those compelling images. There's another passage in the book where he talks about people leaving London, going out into the woods, everybody being afraid in those surrounding towns to come anywhere near them because they might be carrying plague. And how when the sick people from London died, the people in the villages around would position themselves downwind of the people who had died and dig holes far away and then use branches to pull the bodies over, being carefully out of the wind so that the germs wouldn't carry. This is, you know, 1665, but we're still kind of in the same place and those images still really resonate with us. I've seen other novelists steal those images from Dufoe for both science fiction and historical fiction novels about diseases. They're still really powerful.
So we have a couple more questions here. Let's keep going. Thank you. Okay. Let's see what, these may be a bit out of order, but can Andrea give an example of bad historical fiction? Or can Andy?
Andrea can give a lot of examples, but she's not that cruel. I will give one that I think the person who wrote it can bear it. Many of you maybe read The Thornbirds at some point in your life. That's a fun book to read, and she's an interesting writer. Colleen Mccullough, later in her life, wrote a long series of historical novels about Roman history. And she draws on pretty much the same exact sources that Shakespeare drew on for his great history plays. And so if you read Antony and Cleopatra or some of the, or Julius Caesar, some of the great plays side by side with some of her novels, you can see passages where he ripped off Plutarch and where she ripped off Plutarch and Shakespeare, and you can see how they handled them. And I will only say that Shakespeare does not suffer by the comparison. They're very detailed, but they're not very illuminating about character, whereas in the Shakespeare plays, the events have sometimes been altered to suit authorial convenience, and yet somehow character is illuminated. That's all I'm going to say about that.
Yes. So follow-up question from Mary Nell. Do you then think that those historians who invent dialogue are wrong to do that? That was a follow-up from the earlier question. What happens when you introduce dialogue?
I mean, I do think it's, I mean, a lot of people, some historians do that. I think it's a mistake. Because it's not, there is no evidential base for that. You have to invent it. And you can substantially change narratives by doing it. Having said that, I don't know if we put this grand strategy thing in the reading. I don't know.
I put one paragraph, but not the whole thing. Go for it.
So this is kind of related to this. This is from a history book on grand strategy, not a particular fruitful source of novels, you might think. But anyway, but his discussion. But anyway, so this is about British strategic policy making during the War of the Spanish Succession, which is in the early 1700s. But here's what it says. The proximity of the major military and political players in London during the winter when strategy was made makes the process of strategic formulation almost unrecoverable for the historian, at least in its more interesting aspects. Parliamentary debates and gossip remains, there's written accounts of that, but thousands of other informal discussions in saloons, taverns, dinner parties, balls, and random encounters are lost. Unofficial correspondence that exists only occasionally, etc., etc. So here's a sense of important players, senior political figures, senior military and naval officers meeting in salons or over a dinner party, and actually having the kind of conversations that have really major consequences. I mean, this is also, I mean, from my own work, this is clearly true in World War II as well. It's a sort of fallacy of historians that everything gets into the documents. It doesn't. A great deal doesn't get into the documents. So what do you do about that? I think you've got to try and the solution for me is and it's not a very completely convincing one all the time, but I think you have to look at the outcome and work back from the outcome to where those decisions may or may not have been made, how they could have discussed, how those discussions could have been shaped, and so on and so forth, without putting words into people's mouths that you have no evidence for them saying. So I don't know, does that?
No, that makes total sense to me. And that's also, in a very real way, that's what makes historical fiction possible. No matter how much evidence there is, or how well someone's life is documented, or how well an event is covered, that's the part that doesn't get covered. The part where, you know, the admiral.
This is where we started, right?
Yeah.
This is where
The part where the admiral walks off the ship and he's about to give the command of a boat to someone, and he bumps into an old friend on the way, and they go out and have 11 drinks together. And along the way, they talk about a girlfriend they shared when they were young. And then it turns out somebody still owes somebody money, and something else happens, and he gives the command of the boat to that guy, and that guy wins the war, or whatever. But decisions get made in the way we know them to be made.
When you first told that story, the officer, the admiral gave the order and leaves the boat, and the captain says that officer's a complete beep idiot. And I thought that was brilliant, because you would have record of the command telling the ship to move from point A to point B, but there would be no record of the fact that everyone thought this was completely insane.
Yeah, that's the part that doesn't get into the record. And that's why we can fiction. And that's why fiction, although again, I repeat, it's not our job to explicate history in a more sugary manner, but we can bring something to historical understanding too, and that's the moment where we do that if we guess well.
In a way,
let me just give another example of this, because this is where we skate very close to the line. This is a wonderful book. This is called Culloden. It's about a battle, the defeat of the Scots rebellion in 1745, and it begins with it's a wonderful description of the English army marching out to the battle from Inverness, and I'm just going to quote 2 lines. He says, Preble says, "A northeast wind pulled at the flame of the guard's tent lanthorn and teased the waters of the Moray Firth, where Rear Admiral Byng's warships and transports rode at anchor." I mean, it's sheer poetry, right? But there's no evidence this lanthorn ever existed. It's a completely fictitious, there must have been one, and the flame within it was probably, what does he say, pulled by the wind. I mean, that's probably true. But that is a novelistic invention in a history. I personally don't object to it. I know a lot of professional historians would.
Do they?
Oh. Would I mean, to me, it makes the book, it's the novelistic element, or the poetic element contributes to the.
Yeah, that's what kept my interest in that book. But.
I think that you both sort of describe where you fit into a continuum of truth and storytelling, you know, sort of, there's kind of a place for everyone in there. And as a reader picks up a piece of writing, you have to find out where you are in that continuum and decide that you're okay being there, because there are different degrees of both truth and storytelling in both of your genres.
Yeah, absolutely. And you could put any other pair of historian and historical fiction writer here, and you would be having a very different discussion. It's not just that we are working in different disciplines, it's that we have our own particular places along the continuum within our disciplines. And so our interaction comes out of the space or the lack of space between our two places on our two lines. It would be totally different for someone else.
Indeed. We have a few more questions. Let's keep trying here, okay? And one specific one, Anne, yes, they have both been vaccinated. There was a concern about you sitting unmasked side by side. So that we want to resolve.
Okay, we appreciate I'm going to speak for myself. I really appreciate the concern, but it does kind of speak to what it's to the reality of living inside a pandemic, and the idea of questions that maybe couldn't have necessarily been asked now are legitimate to ask. That's troubling. That troubles me, I have to say. So anyway.
But that's also super interesting.
Yeah, super interesting.
Because talk about a moment with which one might start either a history or a historical fiction, that we would be thinking about that question during this evening is in itself so alive and so charged that it makes it's a very vivid image to begin a book about a pandemic, that one night finally two people a year into a pandemic could sit side by side and have a discussion, and that people would notice that they were sitting side by side. So much about our world is in that moment, and that's the kind of image and moment that both of us as writers look for and try to use to encapsulate a lot of meaning in a small space in our writings.
Well, that's what separates you from the rest of us, is you notice those moments. In that way.
It's our job to notice.
In that way.
That's what we do.
All right, let's go. Let's tackle a few more of these. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt if you had.
No, go ahead.
Okay. I'm going to back up a little bit. Sorry, I've done these a bit out of order. About 6 more minutes, but this one's been pending for a while, so I'm going to throw it at you. Sally asks, what do historians and writers of historical fiction do to truly educate current populations about the ridiculously repetitive trap war is for the average people who are always caught up and suffer the most in war? As a species, we've glorified the warrior as a heroic character since we started to make stories for each other. Do we not then help perpetrate war when we elevate warriors, kings, generals, etc. to heroic stature and deny the cost of their destructive choices and action?
May I go first?
You may go. You most certainly may.
All right. That's a great question, and one that I think about a lot, and I'm pretty sure Andy does too, given the content of his writing. And we both addressed it in our writing. I wrote a novella called Archangel a while back, which is about a soldier at the very end of World War I who's been left, whole units were left in Russia to fight long after the official end of the war. The perspective is very much that of the common soldier and some people who know him, not the generals, not the people making strategy, not the politicians who've forgotten those people are over there. One thing we can do as writers is shift that perspective from the people at the top giving orders and entrapping people in these wars to the people who are experiencing the wars. And historians, particularly Andy, do this also. Why don't you talk about that some?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question because I think it speaks to writing history that works at many levels and has to work at many levels, because I do think it's important to write about wars. I think World War II shapes the entire modern world in all kinds of ways. I think it shapes its power relations on an international level. You can't write about the war without writing about. I mean, you can, but I think it loses a great deal without actually writing about military affairs and what happens. And can you do that in a non-heroic way? I hope you can. I mean, I don't the reason in this introductory paragraph, for example, is that the image of the bombers flying overhead is then immediately juxtaposed with the image of terrible destruction rained on Japanese cities. I mean, that's a deliberate choice. You can read, I mean, if you really put your mind to it, you could probably read hundreds of accounts of this ceremony, none of which mention that. You know, all of which we'll talk about the airplanes, we'll talk about the ships, we'll talk about the surrender ceremony, but will not contextualize them in terms of what did this mean in terms of the actual character of the war that had got these characters to that point in history.
There's a reason you very purposefully use the word annihilation there.
Yeah,
you didn't have to use that word in the third or fourth line of your book. You didn't have to mention the fact at all, but having mentioned it, you didn't have to label it annihilation. And just by that choice, he's shifting our point of view away from that sort of heroic view of the end of the war and making us think about what actually happened to the people caught up in the war. And that's one of the reasons I sort of noted that word when you first presented those lines.
Yeah. No, I mean, I don't say there's an easy solution to it, because, but I truly believe that the only way to avoid future horrors is to understand the ones that have gone before, and how they structured the world and how they organized the world we live in today. And you know, that does mean, I think that means, and I think that's true from a novelistic point of view as well. I think it means facing up to some things that are deeply disconcerting and unpleasant, and without valorizing them, which is hard. Actually, there's an additional point right in there, which is, I mean, you could argue, and I thought about this. I mean, here are the names of the airplanes that I cite here, right? This is a poetic list, right? Avengers, Corsairs, Hellcats, and Helldivers. I mean, those are heroic names, right? That have been given to these. I mean, I'm citing them to try and make a point about the sort of heroization of instruments of death. That's why they're in there, not because they're interesting names in and of themselves. I don't really care about, you know, why are these things called what they're called? Anyway.
Right. Why are they called what they're called? And why is the writer of the history naming them early on in the way he is? He's making you think through that.
Well, you would only name the names of the winners' planes, maybe not the names of the losers' planes.
Yeah.
Here we are. Here's a few more questions, and it is just about 1 minute till 8. So for those of you who may have to wrap it up, we have one more in the series, the Lyceum series next week, and we look forward to having you join us at that time. For those of you who are interested, we'll carry on with a couple more questions. Okay, Greg's comments. Writing, writers, and books are a wonderful thing. I'm grateful for the skills and mix is offered by your trades. Do you have concern regarding the future forward due to e-media, the 7-second attention span of humans, and or the immediate fix people seem to need to gain something they will soon forget?
Yes.
No.
I'm not concerned about e-media. I do worry about our attention spans, but the best way to have a longer attention span is to read, to read long narrative history, to read extended fiction. That's a way of training our attention span not to work in 7-second aliquots, which is not a good way to move through your life. But interesting that you say.
Well, I think that when people feel the need to act and to think about how they can make change, I think they reach for the right thing, and they put the time in and put the effort in and dig into what they need to dig into to understand what they need to understand. So, I mean, I wish my books had a mass audience now. They're not going to. But I like to think that, what's being put together there will be of use to people in the future. And I'm not particularly, I think the short attention span is a more episodic phenomenon in that sense, I guess, that will be overcome as it has been. You know, I think of stories of, you know, factory workers who read Das Kapital on their lunch break, you know, in the 19th century, because they wanted to know how to organize and how to fight. They weren't you know, in their daily lives, they weren't being organized to have any longer attention spans than we maybe do today. But when they saw a need to do something, they're going to spend the time and effort studying to do it. So I'm really confident that people that people will rise to the challenge. There's a bit of optimism.
No, we're optimists. We think culture will continue.
Yeah, we do. And actually get better.
Whoa, I'm not going that far.
Oh, I am.
Okay, next question from says, in writing historical fiction, how do you determine when your imagination takes over and you risk confusing the reader about the history of an event?
Another really great question, and one that every historical novelist will answer differently. If you're going to change facts, then your rules for when you're going to worry about that are going to be different than if you're not going to change any facts. Just to go back to the very beginning of our discussion tonight, I would just remind you that that there are no predetermined facts that are not interpreted by somebody. So when you say confusing a reader's perception of events, then I have to say, what perception of events is that, and where did the reader get those from? Because the historian who wrote the history that the person thinks they know the facts from also had her or his point of view and her or his perspective and skewed those facts in a certain way. And so do I as a historical novelist. So maybe the short answer for all that is you need to pay close attention to what the person you're reading is trying to teach you. You need to be aware that they're trying to tell you something, whether they're a historical novelist or a historian. They have something they're trying to get you to understand. And we have tricks for doing that.
And as every good educator will point out, everything counts. Everything
counts. Yeah.
And the selection of everything is intentional, or it's important. Okay, we still have a few more to go and a few more and questions being added. So let's see. This one's been here a bit. How might oral history, both past and contemporary, play a role in historical fiction, since oral history often captures some aspects of emotion, feeling, memory, etc.? Thanks.
That's great. Do you want to talk about that in history too?
I mean, I'm not going to speak to oral history in general. I mean, but I do think that letters as a form of sort of personal expression, I mean, you're not actually speaking to the person, but you are hearing their voice, can be a very powerful historical tool. I mean, for example, I did a project on the experience of soldiers as tourists in Italy in World War II, which was totally based on letters that soldiers wrote home, or substantially based on letters soldiers wrote home, where they would describe. I mean, the title of the article is "I felt more like a tourist than a soldier," which came right out of a soldier's letter to his wife. And you know, that's actually a more complicated statement than it might seem on the surface, because he actually kind of felt bad about feeling more of a tourist than a soldier. He wished he felt more of a soldier. So you know, so that was a sort of oral history type, and it got you into some of the, I think your question was saying, sort of some of the more kind of sense of perception, I mean, he talked a lot about smell, for example. He talked about a lot about how bad he thought Italy smelled, how dirty it was. I mean, those kind of things which give you a sense of that sort of direct relationship with a society, with a culture that you're not going to get from a straight history of the U.S. occupation of Italy during World War II. You had to dig into that level of the lived experience of soldiers and of Italian civilians who experienced that.
And a lot of historical novels have roots in oral history, in actual conversations. When we're lucky enough to recognize that something important has happened before every living witness has disappeared, we can and do go and talk to those people. Tolstoy did this most famously in War and Peace.
Mm-hmm.
You know, standing where we stand now, we look back at War and Peace and we think, oh, that all happened a million years ago, but it didn't. And Tolstoy, when Tolstoy wrote that, he went back to his grandparents and people of his grandparents' generation, and he had long, long conversations with them. And so what we think now are the great, most vivid, brilliantly rendered battle scenes in the book, the Battle of Borodino, the Siege of Moscow, those, Tolstoy wasn't alive then. He went back to his grandparents and listened and listened and listened to what they said. A lot of our World War II novels, a lot of our Depression novels are based, not like Pale Horse, Pale Rider, on someone who lived through it, but on someone who was the child, the grandchild, even the great-grandchild, who had the wit to go back and talk to those older people before they passed away and get those vivid conversations. So it's a huge element in historical fiction.
Thank you. Let's see. Again, I've kind of lost track of the order these came in, so I'll, and they keep coming. Let's see. Do authors of historical fiction ask illustrators to create images for their novellas?
I don't know the answer for that. I've never had any illustrations for work I've done. My vague understanding of it is that's usually something the publishing company decides, that they commission illustrators. I think writers don't always have that much to say about it, but I might be wrong about that.
And let me say,
yeah,
is I mean, the use of illustration as we start the sort of, what do you say, Andrea, the sites of nucleation? I mean, it's tremendously powerful in history writing as well, right? I mean, the selection of the 10 images that the publisher gives you, I mean, to me, is a long and complicated process, that you to choose images that are going to not just illustrate, but spark exactly the sort of thoughts that we were having and talking about in relationship to the surrender of the Japanese on the Missouri, or to make a map. What are you asking a map make when you ask someone to make a map to illustrate a history? What are you asking? What should the map look like? What should it show? And to be honest, there's aspects of that which I don't have. I have no satisfactory answer to. Though any of you who've read military history will know that battles are, you know, there's always clear-cut arrows and the troops are moving and it's all. But it never. The sense of what it doesn't show, what's happening behind the lines, what's happening to the devastated environments, what's happening to the civilian populations. You know, how does that get illustrated on a map, which is simply showing the movement of troops, but not really the movement of a war? How would you show that in a map? I spend a lot of time in my book on World War II trying to solve that problem, and it wasn't solved adequately. So whoever asked the question about the sort of the new technology, that may well be something that you know, that actually is a useful way of having you know, online resources connected to books, because you can illustrate a lot more through those kind of mediums, it seems to me.
Well, you're suggesting something too that the cartographers of today are tackling in this minute.
Yeah.
And story maps and the visual representation of data and the layers of graphic information that we can see are a whole other way to illustrate a story.
And we had a brilliant illustration of it for those of you who are here for the lecture on Native America two weeks ago. Matt Keegle's illustration of colonial New England, which had a huge Iroquois territory. I mean, an actual physical territory that was marked the Iroquois territory, which you don't often see that on a map. It was so that in and of itself was gave you a whole different visual sense of the physicality of colonialism and relations with Native Americans. So,
Of the story.
of the story and of the entanglement of the stories, absolutely.
Okay, we have 6 more questions. I'm going to say we'll wrap up after the.
Yeah, that's we'll do the
Okay.
6.
We've run a little extra. It's now almost 8:15. So maybe just a quick response to this. Well, this comment is not unique tonight, but I spontaneously recoil when I see old movies with people behaving normally. My mind is so bound up in the pandemic. So that just comment. Another comment. This has been very interesting presentation discussion. Thank you so much. Is a purely objective history even possible or even have any meaning? That might take a while.
No, it will.
First thought. You could be a yes or a no.
No.
Yeah, the first thought would be no.
Okay.
I mean, you can get close to it. You can try for it. You cannot violate. You cannot violate fact.
Yeah.
But
still, who you are, the entire, your whole essence as a human being is going to influence the way you write that history. And that's why we keep writing histories over and over. Why do we need, a new history of the Civil War, or even of the Battle of Gettysburg every 5 years? Because it changes every time a new person in a new state of mind, in a new place writes it. We bring ourselves to it inevitably and usefully, I think. Even
without new historical factual revelations, which sometimes there are.
But our perspectives change.
But there's perspectives change, absolutely. Which I think was on your points, Elizabeth, when you were talking about the continuum between fact and, I mean, the fact end of that is always a bit squishy.
That's a technical.
That's a historian's term right there.
Yeah.
And the story doesn't end because you authors, whether it's the history or the historical fiction, you as authors bring yourselves into the story. As you just mentioned, Andrea, you are now part of the stories that you are telling by virtue of your perspective.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, lest I continue to comment, I'm going to go ahead and get these 3 questions to you. One more, how would you go about deciding whether you should tell a story as historical fiction or instead tell it as a narrative, nonfiction? What factors would push you in one direction or the other?
That's a really hard and useful question that would take hours to really answer, but as quickly as I can, it depends a lot on the writer. Are you more comfortable working in creative nonfiction? Are you more comfortable writing fiction? It depends a lot on the subject and how much you know about your subject. Is there a lot of good documentary evidence? Is there any good documentary evidence? And it depends a whole lot on your level of emotional connection to the subject. It's impossible to write good fiction about a historical, about a real person without the sort of mysterious, it's almost like falling in love. I mean, you have to feel this huge attraction for your subject to be able to imagine yourself inside the subject and looking out. And if you can't find that connection, you'd be better off doing it as nonfiction.
Mm.
I'm just going to piggyback one thought on that there, which is, it's surprising again. I mean, every time we talk about this, how close the methodologies are in some cases, because I mean, I've certainly had the experience in archives of reading a diplomatic exchange between someone in the State Department and an American official and stuff, and none of them are points of view I particularly agree with. So I mean, it's not like I'm deeply empathizing with them, but you know them so well, you know what the response is going to be. When person X writes to person Y, you know how person Y is going to respond to that because you've seen them respond to it already in 5 other cases, and you know those people, you know their personalities to some degree. So if you were thinking about invention and sort of the use of historical evidence as the basis of fiction, I think sort of very much kind of in that area.
Sometimes it's really useful to ask yourself too, what can you gain by doing it as fiction that you can't do by doing it as creative nonfiction? Is there some element to inhabiting the interiority of that person that is going to be necessary to tell the whole story? Or in fact, are you better off with a more distant, more objective voice, trying to present that character in a very rounded fashion from the outside? And if you can answer that question, you know which way to take that.
So interesting. So many more things to talk about here. Here is a follow-up about the illustration question. The photos and illustration from the past, I understand, but I was referencing that fiction may require a new illustration to make a point that the author is putting forth.
Yeah, that's super interesting. It's sort of like asking, how do you film a novel and make the characters that are cast look like the characters that the author imagined? And the answer is usually you lose that battle. We as writers don't get much to say about that. Other people have a lot of ideas about what our characters should look like. And sometimes I wish they didn't, but they do. So we just have to let them go. We write them and they let them go. And it's somebody else's problem after that.
All right, last question. Tom, thanks for hanging in here. I can see you're on the line and I want to answer I want you to answer his question. I sort of saved it for the end. Just thought about dust. Any quick thoughts on that?
It took me 2 years to write that essay. I got no quick thoughts. I don't even know completely what I mean about that, but that was a long, slow thought process for me, and I'll stand by it, but I can't explicate it quickly. So I'm really sorry about that. I wish I had an easy answer, but I don't.
That's the answer that
you can see that I love the nucleation sites. I thought, I mean, that's a profoundly interesting idea to me in thinking about what I do and how I do it. So
for those of you who have not read that essay, please go back and refer to it. It's really, really great. I thoroughly enjoyed reading that essay today, and I will read it again. It was so good. And I happen to be reading Eric Larson's book, Thunderstruck, about Marconi.
Oh, neat. I like that book a lot.
Okay, so many appreciative comments in the chat, which we will be glad to share with you later. For the audience, thanks for hanging in here for so long. Feel free to make a donation to the Grange if you are inspired by these great conversations and interesting ideas. And again, we look forward to seeing as many of you as can join us next Tuesday for the finale of our Entanglements series. Thanks so much, Andy. Andrea. Sorry.
We're getting confused ourselves. It's okay.
Okay, so great. Really great to have you both with us tonight. And